Well, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. It's an honor, in fact. There's so many people here who are part of this conference that whose work I've been reading for years, and whose work I've drawn on in this and other work that I've been doing. So it's great to actually be in the same room with so many of you and to learn from you. Already today in this discussion, all the presentations and questions and comments has been extremely stimulating. So I want to thank the organizers very much for inviting me to be here. I was delighted to learn about this work on finance curse. I hadn't known about it before preparing for this conference. My bad. I should have found out about it earlier. But I was really delighted to read this work. And I guess I can say that we've sort of been working on parallel paths for quite a while, and it's terrific to sort of be bending the paths a bit, and so we can meet and see what's similar and what's different about how we've been approaching this and what we can all learn. As Andrew said, about 2 years ago, I was doing some work with a former graduate student of mine, Juan Montecino, and we put out this study called Overcharge, the High Cost of High Finance for the Roosevelt Institute. And this had built on earlier work that we had been doing. And so I was asked to first describe the approach we took and the findings we developed to try to estimate the net cost of the financial sector in the case of the United States, and then discuss how this relates and connects with the finance curse work that's so interesting, and then to suggest some future areas where we can jointly make progress on all the issues that we've been talking about today and that I'm sure we'll talk about tomorrow as well. And let me just write down the time so I have some sense of when I started. Okay. So just to give some quick background, it's not really that necessary because you all know about these things and we've talked about it some today. But in order to understand the roots of the financial malaise that we have with these overcharged, supercharged, finance curse financial systems, is kind of this transition from what I call boring banking to roaring banking. Boring banking of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that was highly regulated, to this more highly charged financial system that we have in the UK and in the United States and increasingly in other places. This graph shows some of the trends that you've already talked about, that is a decline in bank lending to commercial and industrial firms and a huge increase in real estate lending. That's one of the factors. I think it neatly comes out in this picture, the share of total loan credit, and how financial liberalization, and I would argue, and it's been mentioned today, the bailouts. I think, Christine, you talked about the government guarantees of the financial sector. These two things have led to this massive increase in the growth of roaring banking in the United States and also here in Britain and elsewhere. An important point comes out in this diagram, this graph. This looks at the income share from non-traditional sources. On the left-hand, yes. On the left-hand side is all banks and the 10 large, all banks on the left-hand side. And as you can see, that the income share from non-traditional sources, meaning fees from securitization and those kinds of things, was very low and stable. But the top 10 bank holding companies had a major increase in the share of their income from these fees and other kinds of aspects associated with securitized banking and trading. Now, I think this is important for a general point. We're talking, and in the finance curse they talk about, you all talk about too much finance. But clearly, I think we all understand that associated with too much finance has been a transformation in the kind of finance. I think if we're just thinking about the size of the financial sector per se as being the cause of problems, we might be misreading the issue. I'll come back to this. But clearly, there's a transformation in the kinds of financial sectors that we have seen that's associated with the very large financial sectors. So the question that we asked is, what is the net cost of this type of financial system, the finance curse, roaring banking, to the economy? And we focused on the US. And essentially what we did was to divide these costs, and it's the costs relative to what it would be if we had a better financial system. I'll say a bit more about how I define that in a while. We divided it into three components. And this, we looked at primarily the period between 1990 and 2005. We didn't want to include, for the first two sets of costs, we didn't want to include the financial crisis. But for the third type of cost, we focused on the financial crisis. So the first one is the cost of excess pay and profit. So what we've been calling rents here today, which have been caused by a variety of things. Still, we need to pin this down. Anti-competitive practices, the marketing of excessively complex and risky products, government subsidies and bailouts, fraudulent activities. So those all filter into excessive pay and excessive profits. So we try to measure that. The second is what we've been talking about today as brain drain or distortion of investment in different sectors. What we call the cost of diverted resources from the productive economy. So the kinds of things we've talked about today. The finance sector growing too large, utilizing too many skilled and productive workers, imposing a short-term focus on business associated with financialization, starving some businesses and households of needed credit. So this is the second cost that we try to estimate, the cost of diverted resources. And the third cost is the cost of the financial crisis itself, the 2008 financial crisis. We can't understand the costs imposed on society in recent times of this new type of this roaring banking, this financialized financial system, unless we take into account the fact that it had a big impact on causing the financial crisis. So those are the three costs that we try to take into account. The cost, which I'm going to go into some detail on, comes to a total of about 13 trillion and $23 trillion. So I'm going to try to explain how we came to that figure. So this is a lot of money. It amounts to between $40,000 and $70,000 per person, or between $105,000 to $184,000 for the typical American family. One way to think about that is, without this loss, the typical American household would have doubled its wealth in retirement. In the United States, the typical family doesn't have a lot of retirement income. Okay, so let's first talk about, I'm going to go through, type by type, so you can try to understand how we did this. First, let's talk about rents and excessive profits. Rents. So what do we mean by rents? Well, there's a lot of different definitions. Payments in excess of what they would be in a competitive economy, or payments in excess of what would be required for the service or good to be supplied. These are two common definitions of rents. What are the sources of these rents? Well, I've already gone through some of them. One of them I didn't mention was asset bubbles themselves. Asset bubbles, at least in the recent period, have been an important source of rents, to the extent to which those who work in the financial sector are able to capture them. And there are several different kinds of mechanisms that allow them to do that, including mark-to-market accounting, and the kind of bonus system that allowed traders to take bonuses up front even before the asset was realized, was sold, et cetera. So I think we need to take into account the asset bubbles as a source of rents. One of Christian's colleagues, Irene Levina, who was a a graduate student at UMass did her dissertation on this topic. Very interesting. Oligopoly also enforces rent creation. I think that's been mentioned here today. Market power is a common source of rent creation. And we've had a big increase in concentration among the top banks in the United States, particularly in particular areas like derivatives trading and so forth. And there are other factors that we could talk about if I had more time. So how to measure rents in the incomes of those who work in finance? Well, luckily, and this is true generally for this work, there's been excellent work done in trying to measure some of these things by a range of scholars, some of whom are here tomorrow, I think. So we build on the work of Philippon and Reshef, who wrote a very important paper, Wages and Human Capital in the US Finance Industry in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, where they try to measure rents in finance. It's already been mentioned today. So we basically look at their data set, and we see a massive increase in real wages per full-time employee in finance relative to manufacturing and all sectors. And then we and they break down. Richard Murphy's on Skype.
We don't want him
And then there's a breakdown within sectors, and as I think have been mentioned today, investment banks, security brokers, and dealers, the top line, have higher real wages than the other types of finance. So we use these results to estimate financial rents. What they did, I think it's been described, is they looked at all of the possible factors that economists would suggest would account for wages in finance. And what they find is that after you control for all of these factors, like education, how difficult the job is, other skills, and so forth, there's still a big residual in the regression that is unexplained. And so we could perhaps call this rents. Now, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's just an unexplained residual. But I think people are increasingly saying, well, this is unexplained, so it's really the best measure we have of rents. And so what we did was we took their results and we updated the calculations and so forth. And we looked at banker rents. On the left-hand side is the total rent. On the right-hand side is per worker. Okay? And then we added all that up in real terms. And we always use a discount factor or an interest factor to add it up over time. A pretty low one that's commonly used, 2.5%. So then we get to the total value that way. And we find that the figure we came up with was about $1.4 trillion in excess wages using their work. Okay. Now, excess profits. This is a more difficult and subtle issue. So profits in finance in the United States between 1980 and 2005. Clearly, there was this overall increase, and then it really shot up around 2000. How much of this profits is rent? How much of it is excessive? How do you figure that out? Well, there's several ways of looking at this. From societies and stakeholders' point of view, financial returns must be adjusted for risk. But private finance, especially during this period, often did not have to take into account the risks associated with many of their activities because of the way in which the government bailed out private finance. So again, these government guarantees play a crucial role here, as well as some of the mechanics of how bonuses were accumulated and paid, mark-to-market accounting and so forth. So it is important for us, if we're thinking about the social returns, it's important to adjust the private returns that finance received by the social risks that they imposed on the rest of society. So that's one way to think about calculating the percentage of this that is excessive from a societal point of view. Another perspective is related. It's been developed, written about at least, by Andrew Haldane, who many of you know, in the Bank of England. And he distinguishes between two functions. One is risk-taking, which isn't really necessarily a contribution to productivity growth. It's a decision made by investors about where they're going to invest in terms of the risk-return trade-off. And risk management, which is, in fact, a contribution to overall economic, the size of the pie and economic growth. So in a sense, these two are related, not exactly the same. So what we did is we used some estimates from some Federal Reserve economists who were concerned with this sort of issue. The economist's name is Wang, but she's worked with others as well at the Federal Reserve. And trying to calculate how much of the profit from in the financial sector is excessive from this perspective. So if you look at this chart, you see that unadjusted for risk, the internal rate of return on fixed assets in finance is almost 18%. If you take a risk-adjusted return, calculating risk, it really drops by almost a third to about 6.8%. If you look at the internal rate of return on fixed assets in the private economy, it's about half of the unadjusted for risk return, about 9. So we use these figures to say, okay, adjusting for risk should, kind of an underestimate of this is that about 50% of the profits were excessive, or rents, unadjusted for risk. So we took the data on profits, we put in real terms, accumulated it, put a 2.5% interest rate on it, and came up with almost $2.3 trillion of excess profits. So that's how we came up with the $3.6 trillion of excess income and rents. You could do this in several different ways, and so there's a higher bound number, about 4.2 trillion. Okay, so that's the first part. There are two more to go. Excess income and rents, growth costs from misallocation, and the recession costs. Okay, misallocation costs of finance. Too much finance or finance doing the wrong things. Many of you have probably seen this quote from James Tobin: "I confess to an uneasy physiocratic suspicion, perhaps unbecoming in an academic, that we are throwing more and more of our resources, including the cream of our youth, into financial activities, remote from the production of goods and services, into activities that generate high private rewards disproportionate to their social productivity." And this was in 1984 when he wrote this. He'd be rolling in his grave now if he saw what's happened since. So I use the same studies that others have talked about, and the finance curse authors also talked about, Cicchetti and Karoubi, and Ugo Panizzo, I think, who's going to be speaking with us tomorrow, and others, who've looked at this, estimated this, this too much finance. And they find, as you know, that up to, for a while, as private credit to GDP ratio grows, and the size of the financial economy grows, economic growth goes up. But after a certain point, when finance becomes too large, the rate of growth of GDP goes down. Now, why is there this negative relationship? Well, that's what we've been talking about today, so I'm not going to add anything more to that, other than to say, I think we have to probably consider the whole panoply of things associated with financialization to help us understand it. It's not skill, I think, that is important, but short-termism and other factors that we know is associated with financialization is probably important as well. But it's important to get to the bottom of this. I think Christian's work was very interesting, and more could be done. So we use these estimates from their work to say, okay, the United States has too much finance, according to them. This is all the countries where private credit exceeded 90% of GDP on average from 2005 to 2009. On the left, we see Cyprus, Iceland, the USA. UK is a little bit behind. All the way down here, we have Italy, Israel, and others. Their analysis says how much below the maximum level of economic growth these countries have been performing, given how much bigger their financial sector is relative to the optimum. So we simply applied their coefficients from their analysis to how big the financial sector in the United States was over this period of time. That's essentially how we did it. This is the United States private credit relative to GDP. You see after 1985 or so, it rose above some threshold. Here it's 100%. It could have been 90%. So we associated each of these excessively large financial sectors with how much lower GDP growth would have been relative to what GDP growth would have been if it had been just at 100%. So that's the counterfactual, the optimum level. So again, we found that the United States growth path was the black line. It could have been the red line if the financial sector was the appropriate size. And we added up all that's in the middle, that red shade, et cetera, and came up with misallocation. So growth cost from misallocation is anywhere from $2.5 trillion to $4 trillion, depending on exactly which coefficients. All these studies run multiple regressions, so you have to figure out which coefficients are you going to use, so we used a range. Now, both of these approaches you can see are very, very simple. Very simple. We used existing work that had tried to quantify some of these relationships, and then we tried to apply them to the US economy, and that's how we came up with these numbers. Excess income and rents, growth costs from misallocation. Finally, the financial crisis that started in 2007, 2008. One of the problems in using that is, there are two big problems we ran into. One was, is the financial sector itself 100% to blame for the crisis? There are people out there who say, well, they were the trigger event. They were the precipitating cause, but there are a lot of underlying causes that caused the financial crisis. The decline of the United States, the rise of China, increased competition, falling rate of profit, stagnation. There are many things going on at the same time. So can you really attribute 100% of the blame to finance, and therefore 100% of the cost of the crisis to the financial sector? Probably not. However, there's a lot of evidence that's been done by various economists that suggests that financial crises that last longer and are more costly to society than economic recessions or crises that are not associated with financial crises. So what we did again is have a maximum estimate and a minimum estimate. The minimum estimate was we figured out, according to the literature, how much longer recessions last typically if they're associated with financial crises, and we use that figure to get the lower bound. And then to get the upper bound, we attributed 100% of the crisis to the financial sector. So we use Federal Reserve estimates to estimate the cost of the crisis. The simplest thing to do, again, there are many other things you could add to this. We, again, took the lowest bound kind of approach, is to say how much output was lost as a result of the crisis and the recession that was associated with the crisis. So the top black line is how the economy was growing prior to the crisis. The bottom black line is what happened to our economy when the crisis hit. And the question is, how long is it going to take our economy to recover to the path that it would have been on had there not been the crisis? Now, what is the path that the US economy would have been on if there hadn't been a crisis? Is it just following the same top black line? Is that the path? Or are there other things going on in our economy that would tend to lower the growth of the economy, like demographic changes, something else? Okay, so then maybe the right counterfactual growth path perhaps is a lower line. Okay. The other question is, how long is it going to take the U.S. economy to return to the path that it would have been on, whether it's the original path or a somewhat lower path? It hasn't returned there yet. President Trump says he's going to get us there soon. I'm not holding my breath. So what we did was just did the simplest thing, the kind of the safest thing to do was to take the Federal Reserve's estimate that our economy is going to return to the appropriate path, but they estimate it's not going to happen. See the bright red line in the middle? It's not going to happen until 2023. By the way, most of the blue chip forecasters, the bottom blue line, they don't think it's ever going to return to the original path. That the costs of the crisis are just going to keep going on and on and on. But we didn't assume that. Okay, so that's what we did. So the recession cost then at this lower bound that I described is about $6.5 trillion, and at the higher bound is about $14.5 trillion. There's a timing issue because since the path doesn't return till 2023, we had to extend the time period over which we're calculating this. But roughly speaking, the total cost is between $13 trillion and $23 trillion. Now, that's real money. But as Andrew said, it's really an underestimate. There are things that we didn't necessarily take into account about broader problems with financialization, the problems of inequality associated with the financial sector, and how that might affect the health and welfare in our economy, and the impact on tax revenue that undermine the ability of the government to invest in education and health and so forth. We didn't take into account a lot of possible impacts of the financial sector, negative impacts of the financial sector on the economy. So, so here we have it. Now, I don't know how much time I have left.
Another 5 minutes? Another 2 minutes?
Okay, at least give me 5 minutes.
5 minutes, huh? We can go to 5.
Okay, so where do all these excessive financial wages, profits, and other costs come from? We thought that there were two ways to study this. One was to start at the bottom and look at all of the different institutions and instruments in the financial sector and think about how much rents were associated with them, how much inefficiency was associated with them, what were the costs associated with them, and add it up to get to the total cost. Instead, what we did was we said, well, if there's rents in the economy, if there's misallocation costs, if there's a cost of the financial crisis, it should appear at the top, but we're not 100% sure which institutions, which practices, which activities are generating these rents, generating this misallocation costs and so forth. So we then look at different sectors, asset management, private equity, banking, payday lending, and so forth. But it was very difficult, just in what we did, to associate costs with each of these sectors and aggregate them. So that is maybe something that somebody would like to do, but we did kind of a top-down approach to estimating the costs. I'm going to skip the fun part, but I promised I would talk about, let's see, I want to get to, okay. I promised I would talk about the comparison with the finance curve. So if I could have 3 or 4 minutes to do that? Okay. So it should be apparent there's a huge overlap between these ideas and those developed in the finance curves report. The economic capture, crowding out, Dutch disease, brain drain, financialization, these are all factors which could explain these costs that I identified. I skipped over the part where I was talking about political capture, but that's an important part of the story. How is it that the financial sector is able to keep doing these things, even despite the financial crisis? How is it that they're able to continue imposing these costs on our economy? They talk about political capture, the cognitive capture, the economics profession generating an economic theory that rationalizes the efficiency of all of these activities. That's my tribe, the economists. A lot of us do that. Not me, but a lot of people do. The revolving door and political contributions. I think interestingly and usefully they talk about how this adds up to kind of a country capture, that the financial sector captures the apparatus, government apparatus, the socialization apparatus, et cetera, of various countries. I think this is a real danger, and it's very interesting how they discuss this. And the dynamic aspects, the loop between the political capture, which reinforces the economic capture, and vice versa. How useful is the analogy to the resource curse itself? I'm a bit ambivalent about this. I do think it's very useful for suggesting channels of impact and influence. It certainly helped to develop the ideas of crowding out, political capture, country capture, all of which I think are useful. But I think if we try to apply it too strictly, it gets us into a bit of a straitjacket, since finance is not the same as oil. It also varies tremendously between small economies and large economies, like the United States and Great Britain. It's easier to see country capture in Jersey than it is, well, it's easy to see it in New Jersey, too. But it's harder to see it in the whole United States and in quite the same way. For these larger countries, there are many industries. So how do they get captured? It's not just finance. We have multinational corporations. We have industrials. We have service sectors. We all have. How do they get captured this way? Well, I do have a hypothesis as to how they did. And it gets back to this issue of the financialization of non-financial corporations. But not just the financialization of the non-financial corporations, it's the financialization of the CEOs. And let me talk about that, since that, I think, is we haven't spoken about. The CEOs of large corporations, the large non-financial corporations, are massively wealthy, and they need asset managers, and they need accountants, and they need people to not only manage their money, but as people here who've done great work on this know, how to hide their money in tax havens and so forth. There's a whole haven, and I'm talking to people who know more about this than I do. There's a whole haven industry made up of financiers, banks, and so forth, who help these individuals manage their wealth. This is connected to inequality, the massive inequality that we spoke about. So I think it's safe to say that there's been this massive joining of interests between the CEOs of non-financial corporations and the CEOs of financial corporations, even if you don't necessarily buy the whole financialization of non-financial corporations argument. I think we really need to look at the people who are making the decisions in the non-financial corporations. So I think what we have is political capture is facilitated in these large countries by the financialization of not just non-financial corporations, but by their CEOs. So, Treasure Island meets CEO financialization, meets political and country capture by finance. So in terms of future research, I think it would be very interesting to kind of connect these things, as some of you are uniquely situated to do. And this can help explain the transmission of the finance curse from the financial sector to the broader economy in large, complex economies like the United States and the United Kingdom. Thank you very much.